Recommendations on life-changing books. Oh, last shot, I like that. I would start with the book of John. It's one of the Gospels in the New Testament. Now, there's a life-changing book that changes my life, that one. There's a very unknown book from the ancient Mesopotamian world. It's in the Old Testament. It's called Ecclesiastes. I highly rate the book of Ecclesiastes. Oh, it's gorgeous. It's one of the most phenomenal pieces of wisdom literature we have on earth. No one knows it exists. And then the people who do know it exists don't even read it. Oh man. It depends if you want something a bit more academic. If you want something a bit more casual. Aside from the Gospel of John and aside from the book of Ecclesiastes, the book that has affected me the most and has really shaped my view of the world is a book called Theological Science. Theological Science by Thomas F. Torrance. Get your hands on this somewhere, probably bookdepository.com. You're in for a world of fun. A world of fun, honestly. Theological Science it's a dream. It's a dream. It looks at how, I've gone about it for quite a long time. There are different sciences in the world, like physics is a type of science, and like chemistry is a type of science, and biology is a type of science, and it looks at how theology is also a type of science. And so in the same way that, say, biology, an aspect of biology might be the science of trying to ascertain knowledge of the human body, like medical science for instance, if you use different sciences to ascertain knowledge of different objects of inquiry. And so Torrance argues that theology is a type of science where you're trying to ascertain knowledge of who God is. And what he argues is that different sciences require different methodologies for knowing them. Is that in order to understand a object of inquiry, the object of inquiry itself informs us of how to go about knowing it. For instance, if you're trying to understand a fish in a rock pool, you don't use equations for understanding gravity. So if you want to understand gravity, you need to use physics equations, but then to try and apply those different physics equations to then try and understand, say, a fish in a rock pool is doing it wrong. And so it's really important that what we do is, when it comes to understanding Christian theology, we need to make sure we use the right type of methodology to get to know the object of inquiry, which is who God is. He argues the way to come to know knowledge of who God is to do it through theological texts. And I think what happens is we had this problem in the West where we seem to think that there's a huge divide between, say, science and belief, or science and religion. But the problem is people that come to that conclusion are taking theological texts and using that to try and do biological knowledge acquisition, and that's not going to work. But then also people try and take biological information and then try and use that to ascertain knowledge of who God is, and that's also not going to work. There's huge error, I think, in assuming that, say, faith and science are contrary to each other. Making sense of who God is one type of science, but then making sense of biology or evolutionary theory is a different type of science, and they all actually coincide. What Michael Polanyi shows in his book is the idea of belief and fact isn't actually so separate from each other. So one thing that Polanyi shows is that all knowledge acquisition always actually starts with trust before anything else. And we don't like that because we like to think that we're more critical with our thinking than we actually are willing to admit. But essentially any belief that you come to actually starts with putting trust in the people teaching it to you. For instance, I have never left Earth and looked out and seen that there's 9 planets in the solar system. I was taught that by my teachers, and I'm going to choose to trust them that that's true. And so I'm trusting the teachers that they're telling me the truth before I even go out and try and understand whether it's true or not. Flat Earthers are quite interesting because they show us that aspect of knowledge. They're choosing not to trust the authoritative people. That's the question, Monos. That's a good question. Is the object of theological inquiry provable, is the question you want to know. Because theology is the science of trying to understand who God is, but is the object provable, which is God, essentially? Thomas Torrance is arguing Christ himself is the revelation of God coming to us, proving God's existence. And so if we say turn to wondering about who God is through, say,
We are losing objective
studying biology or through, say, studying physics, we're never going to be able to understand if God is provable because we're already starting with the wrong type of science. But if we start asking the question through theology, does God exist, then we're using the right type of science to ask the question. And he says within the realm of theology, Christ shows that God exists and that God is provable. And that's because Christ is both a human being, and the Christian argument is, which I think is provable, is the inner relations of God put together in one person. There's these technical theological terms. One's called the homoousion of Christ, which means that the very ontology, the very being of God, the very essence of God's reality, and a human being who is capable of knowing things is two natures in one person, two indivisible natures in one person. He's basically the walking being of God, making himself present to people. And so in that way, Torrance says that in order to do theological science, it needs to be done with knowing who Christ is. And so if you want to understand who God is, then it actually means you actually need to be in relationship with another person. Because it's like, say, psychology, for instance, is another type of science, and that's a science of two different subjects coming together relationally to meet. But those, whilst they're two subjects, because they're two people meeting, they still objectively exist in reality. Like, I actually exist here in reality, I'm real. And you exist in reality, you're real. And so we're two different objects in reality coming to meet each other, even though we're subjective human beings. And so the argument goes that within theology, you know, whilst it's Christ as a person who we come to know personally as a subject, we're both two objective human beings in existence. If you believe in God, so he exists. So I think that it's more, do I believe that Jesus offers enough evidence to suggest that there is an existence of God? And I think he does, because I think Jesus walked the earth and we have that data. We treat the New Testament as a theological text, and it informs us of theological knowledge. And within that theological text, we have this data set that explains who this Jesus is, and that he walked the earth, and that he did these miracles, and essentially that he said and claimed that he was God, not just with his words, but through the actions that he did. The sorts of things that he did was fulfillment of the Old Testament expectation of who God was and what God's like. The way he challenged and engaged in various arguments with the religious leaders of the time were things that showed that this is God being present with people. His existence, I think, proves the existence of God, the fact that he's existed present with us. So it's not that I believe in God because I believe in God, it's more I believe God exists because Jesus is, so to speak, the scientific data. His very personhood is the scientific data of the existence of God. This book by Thomas Torrance is putting forward this notion that theology ought to be treated like a science to try and ascertain knowledge of who this God is. Chat theology for a while. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. Why did Jesus say he was God in the Bible? When did he? Oh, that's a great question. So there's a lot of places where it's direct words, but you got to think to yourself, are those direct words really, like, how does he prove those words are true? Just because he says it is different to it actually being true. One example is John chapter 10 verse 30. He says, I and the Father are one. Also, John chapter 14 is a really good example about the relationship between the Father, Son, and the Spirit, and how he embodies that entire relationship in himself. There's a lot of things that he does that shows that he's the one being God. So in the Gospel of Mark, there's a really interesting story where there's these people that are looking for a miracle, where he is a person who's lame, who cannot walk, and what he does is he says he wants to get healed by Jesus so he can walk again. And there's all these religious leaders around him in the way, and eventually this person who cannot walk gets put over to Jesus and asks Jesus for healing, and people kind of start scoffing. And Jesus looks around the audience and looks at his religious leaders and thinks to himself, these people are scoffing at the teachings that Jesus was giving at the time about the nature of him being God. So what he does is he says to the religious leaders in front of him, what is easier, for me to forgive sins or for me to heal this person? Basically, oh God, just killed him. I don't think it's going to work out positively in my favour. Oh well. So what happened was Jesus then essentially said to someone, I'm going to forgive your sins.
We have taken objective butter.
The religious people of the time all know that no one can make that claim. Only God can forgive sins. And so when Jesus is saying, I offer you forgiveness of your sins, it means one of two things. It means either he's committing blasphemy because he's claiming to be God and he's not. And that's the point where the religious leaders started conspiring to kill him. Or he is actually God himself. But then what he did was he then healed the person, and so that the person could get up and start walking again. And so he kind of proved that he was able to forgive their sins through then also doing the miracle at the same time. And what's important to know is back in that day, they thought that physical ailments were connected to sin. So if someone had some significant disability, they thought that it was due to sin, and it was because of some sin that caused it upon them. Him healing the person physically also showed in some way that the sin was being forgiven. It's a really important point, Monasis, to ask the question of, well, okay, we're saying we're reading about all this in the Bible, but how do we know the Bible's reliable? And how do we know that what we read in the Bible is true? A, how do we know the whole thing's not just made up? B, how do we know that it gives us an accurate recording of the events that took place? And these are two really important questions to be asking. And then the next question is, how do we know which interpretations of the Bible are more or less accurate than others, and on what basis are they more or less accurate than others? And that's when things start to get really confusing, and that's when wars often happen. It's called textual criticism. It's the study of the reliability of text. What's interesting though is within the study of ancient texts, Christian, atheist, agnostic scholars all alike all affirm and agree that the New Testament is actually the most reliable ancient document that we have. Of all the different ancient documents in the world, say Plato's philosophy, or say Homer's writing of the Iliad and of Homer's writing of the Odyssey, or all the other ancient texts we have access to, all secular, non-Christian, Christian scholars all confirm that the New Testament is the most reliable text that we have. And I find that really fascinating. Because with, for instance, Plato's philosophy is taught throughout all around the world, throughout universities everywhere, and we read the text that he's written, and no one really questions the reliability of the texts. We just assume and know that they're reliable. And the thing is, we have maybe 40 original manuscripts of Plato's work. I can't remember the exact number. I think it might be 60 original manuscripts of Plato's work. And the manuscripts that we have are dated way older than when he was around. So they're copies of copies of copies. And then with, say, Homer's work, it's even less. We have even less manuscripts. It's a very small amount. Yet we read Homer's Odyssey, the Odyssey and the Iliad, and we read Plato's philosophy without questioning whether or not they're reliable manuscripts, and they're all confirmed to be like true tellings of what he actually wrote. Now with the New Testament, we have over 5,000 manuscripts between 3 different languages, and I think so. And some of them are on original papyrus, because different manuscripts belong from different time periods, and different manuscripts are made with different types of parchment. And so papyrus was the type of parchment that was used in the first couple of centuries in the Roman Empire. And so we have some of those original manuscripts of New Testament texts on those papyrus papers, and there's over 5,000 manuscripts overall that we have access to. Which means to me that I think when I'm reading the New Testament today, I go, okay, the words that I'm reading now, I think, and I've come to the conclusion, are a fair representation of the words that were initially written. I think they were. I think that's pretty cool. Like, it gives me evidence, I guess, for my faith, right? To me, faith isn't just mindless belief, but I'm actually seeking for evidence for what to believe, because ultimately I want to know what's real and what's true. The questions around interpretation. Which interpretations are accurate? How do we know which are accurate? Oh, did I run them over? It's probably not worth coming. I'm just driving around killing everyone. Yeah, thanks, last shot. I'm sorry, my thoughts are probably quite loose and sometimes inconsistent and incoherent. I was having a real struggle on Rupture earlier, to be honest.